All right. Week 13, shockingly. It's all going so fast. All right. Okay, how's that? Am I sharing? Jolly good. All right. Well, welcome to Sound Systems Week 13. Bit of housekeeping first. So happy Thanksgiving for next week. Particularly for all the Americans in the class that are someplace else that doesn't do Thanksgiving. So it's always kind of sad. I feel that way on Boxing Day here because it's like it's all over on Christmas Day and no one has Boxing Day. So particular good feelings towards those of you who are in other countries. So there's no lecture next week and there's no assignments next week, except for there is some reading next week. Okay, so I need you to go ahead and read through chapter 8. And then on the following week, I'll take any questions that you might have that came up as you were reading chapter 8. But there's no reading post and there's no activity post. But of course, you now have all the information to get started on your lesson plans. So you might want to do that also. Okay, stop me if you have any questions about any of this. Really, so I looked at the first homework on 3 and 4, and it was a really 2 and 3 or whatever it was a really nice job. It's clear that almost all of you are understanding all the material, which is fantastic. There were a couple of confusions that came up with a couple of people, and I want to just clarify those and make sure everybody else is clear. I think based on the homework you were, but for example, in your comprehensive exams, you get different questions based on different courses. So because I teach the sound system course, I made up the questions for sound systems, and then whoever taught you 555 made up the, so Dong Mei made up the questions for sociolinguistics in 558. So one of the questions, and then they go on a rotation, those questions. But one of the questions that I know I wrote was the difference between prominence and lexical stress. So that may or may not pop up on your rotation, but as at least one person seemed confused about this, I've decided to look at this. So the question was, what was the difference between word stress and prominence? And so one person wrote, prominence is utterance stress, which is true, or stress of a word when said out loud. Word stress or lexical stress is the stress of the word in written or in cited form. So this is sort of true, but the difference between word stress and prominence is not the difference between speaking and writing. And if you use that as your primary division, you're going to get that wrong. Okay, the difference is between whether a written word, whether a given word is important in an utterance or not. So a citation form can be either written or spoken, right? So if you look on page 22, all of these at the top here are in citation form. What I want to do today is give you an overview of women and work. So that's lexical stress. And sometimes if we want to be particularly emphatic, we might say, I told you no, which would be all the lexical stresses, okay? But normally we only make a few of those lexical stresses prominent because we're just following the important information. So what I want to do today is give you an overview of women and work. So I just wanted to clarify that. And then another issue was the question, what are the two most important prosodic features to consider when examining tone unit structure? The answer that this person gave was the two most important prosodic features to consider when examining tone unit structure are key and termination. Key falls on the first prominent syllable in a unit tone, and termination falls on the tonal syllable in a unit tone. Okay, so first of all, that answer was wrong, right? Because the two crucial elements are, in terms of putting together a unit, are prominence and pausing, as it says on page 35, which is fine. Now, key and termination obviously are important. That's the left edge and the right edge boundary of the tonic segment, right? But that's a different question than what are the two most important prosodic features when examining tone unit structure, okay? Also, and this is for everybody, not that this is a problem, but at the moment, but I want you to be very careful with terminology. These are theoretical terms, they mean something, right? So there's no such word as unit tone, okay? There's no such word as tonal syllable. I mean, I know what you mean, but you want to call it a tonic syllable. And if you're calling it, if you're talking about the unit, you want to call it a tone unit, okay? So just watch that when you do these kinds of exercises and these kinds of discussions, because it's not kind of a crapshoot what things mean or how you describe things. They're primitives of a model, theoretical primitives of a model. So you want to get those right. So if no one had any other questions about that, I will move on. All right, so today we're going to look at chapters 6 and 7, and you've got the PowerPoint reading post for this week and activity for this week. So chapter 6 is titled The Social Life of Intonation, and this focuses on the difference between that should say the two types of falling tone and the two types of rising tone. So up until now, we've declared that there are 5 tones, right? 2 types of rising tones, 2 types of falling tones, and a level tone. And that these tones appear on the tonic syllable. And then that's always the final prominent syllable in the tone unit and how it stands out from the rest. So that's all good. What we hadn't done is say, why are we differentiating 2 different kinds of movement, 2 different kinds of movements going up and 2 coming down. So if we go back and have a look at your pragmatic assumptions, these pragmatic assumptions still fit, right? So falling tones, fall and a rise, fall, rising tones, rise and a fall, rise, okay? But these other ones have a added concept of dominance. So one of the pair is basically used by a dominant speaker, and it's very strange if it's used in the same interaction by a non-dominant speaker. So so now you're thinking of sociolinguistics, and now we've got the interaction of sociolinguistics and intonation. A lot of our interactional experiences that we have in every day are asymmetrical, right? Meaning someone has more power in them than the other person has, right? So this can be highly determinative, right? It can be absolutely codified. It can be the difference between a doctor and a patient. So it's clear that the doctor is the expert and not the patient, or the teacher and the student, or the parent and the child, right? It's absolutely clear who's dominant in that interaction. It should be the parent, not the child, right? Or it can be very benign, sort of a benign result of a particular context you're in, which we've talked about before, such as you're in a place that you don't know and you ask a local person for directions. And if they're giving you the directions, they're the ones that know that piece of information. So they now have the dominant role in that interaction. It's no longer equal. You've actually handed over your dominance to them and said, I don't know what I'm doing. I assume you do know what you're doing. So now they've got the role. So these asymmetrical relationships can be all forms and kinds. But either way, intonation has a way of expressing them, projecting our understanding that they exist in ways that become very obvious if we get it wrong. So if you think about it in terms of morphosyntax, you have, for example, the tu, vu pronouns, the TV distinction, where you're basically distinguishing between social distance. So someone like your teacher, you would call vu, and your friend you would refer to as tu. And then think, for example, we've talked about Japanese, about honorific. You've talked about honorifics, I assume, in some of your other classes, where you have languages that have morphosyntactic honorific components. So if you're talking to your professor, you will use a certain kind of language. This is no different. This is a way in which we can also project this using our intonational choices, right? So how they divide is as follows, and I've just literally taken this out of the book. So you've got non-dominant and dominant tone choices in both rising and falling. So in a rising tone, the non-dominant, so the regular tone is the full rise, and the dominant tone is the straight rise. And that's called a referred plus, so a R plus. And then you remember falling tones we also call proclaiming tones. So the regular falling tone is the straight fall, and the dominant falling tone is the rise fall. So that's the plus, the P plus, okay? So let me try and give you an example. There's some examples in the book, but if we take a very straightforward example, which again, remember that when we say taking the dominant role, we mean it could just be, in this case, it's possibly intimates, but it's in you know, a husband and a wife, for example. But speaker, in the second version, the speaker is saying, the answering speaker is saying, don't mess with me now, I'm in the middle of something, so I'm not going to help you right now. So in number one, you've got something like, so the speaker A has said, can you help me? So speaker B is number one, when I finish what I'm doing, I'll help you. Okay, when I'm finished what I'm doing, I'll help you. Okay, which projects an accommodating sort of helpful stance, right? Just hang on a minute and I'll help you, no problem. But you could get something that sounded more like, when I'm finished what I'm doing, I'll help you. Okay, when I'm finished what I'm doing, I'll help you, which sounds more like, if you want me to help you, you'll have to wait. Okay. So if this was an interaction, for example, between an adult and a child, you would not expect the set of tone choices that you get in number two, because it would sound very insolent from a child to a parent. Between two adults, as I say, between a husband and wife, for example, it might be heard as overly emphatic, or as, you know, forceful and exasperated, kind of like, just leave me alone for a second. So it in some cases it's more obvious than in other cases. So there's an activity at the end of this chapter that I included because it happened in front of me in a classroom context. While I was recording these ITAs, and you'll do this activity, or you'll have an option to do this activity. But essentially what happened was, I was recording, and when it was a Chinese, very nice, sweet Chinese ITA math international teaching assistant. And, you know, one of the things we had told her, like we tell all the international teaching assistants, is American undergraduates like to talk, they like to interact, they don't, you know, it's not an environment where you just speak at them. You're supposed to speak to them and interact with them. So we had sort of beaten it into them that they were supposed to ask if there was any questions, if it looked like it was confusing. And so she was doing something with the math, and she heard something behind her, and I'm recording all of this. And but I can't, unfortunately, I can't show you because there's no IRB permission to show you, but from the student, which was the problem, not the ITA. And so she says, does anyone have a question? And everybody's like, no, because it's one of those undergraduate things where they don't really want to ask. They were probably just gossiping or something. They didn't have a question. But she was sort of determined too. She's like, no, really, if you have a question, please ask me. I'm here to answer your questions, you know. And one of the kids, you know, they're all sort of like, ugh. And one of the kids says, no, just go on, please, right? Which you should be able to hear, I'm hoping, is these long rise fall. No, just go on, please, right? So it's going to be this dominant tone right here, this P plus, this rise fall. And it was interesting because all the students in the class turned to him and were like, you know, why are you being so horrible? They all recognized immediately that this was not an appropriate intonation choice. And one of the girls was kind of like, you know, why do you feel you have to be so mean to this, you know, cute little Chinese chick who's trying her hardest? And and it was obvious, everybody turned and looked at him and was like, you know, that's completely inappropriate, it's really rude. And because the lexical things, no, just go on please, were okay. The no's a little rough, but he did say just go on please. My ITA had absolutely no idea what was going on. When I did a post review with her with the videotape, and I said, what do you think is happening here? She's like, nothing. So I said, well, have you noticed, if you look at the videotape, that there's a kind of noise, and a few of the students turn around to look at him, and she's like, okay. And I explained to her that what had happened was, you know, he had made this completely inappropriate remark from an intonational perspective. And everybody knew that if it had been an American, he wouldn't have done that, because an American would have understood immediately that that was insolent in this particular context. So so it's sort of one of those things where if you hear it, it's really obvious, and you know it, you know something is wrong. So it's one of those things that you're not listening for, and it's not necessarily part of what is going on. I mean, to be honest, there were barely any of these tones, these dominant falling tones in my data, in my teaching data, because there's certainly none from the students apart from that one for the ITA. Because it's not an appropriate tone for them to use with a teacher. And teachers don't like doing it most of the time either, because it makes it obvious that you're in trouble, and they're upset with you for some reason. So it's really it really is a way of, when we say expressing nuances, we mean expressing nuances. And for speakers of traditional Englishes, they will hear it if it's violated. They won't recognize that you know, it's because it's a rise full tone rather than a full tone, but they will hear that something's up. So there's lots of other things. That's just one. of the ways in which it's used. But we can, one intonational variant that splits sociolinguistically. There are others, and classroom discourse is a good way to look at them because it is an example of asymmetrical discourse, right? We've learned right from the very beginning, from when you go into kindergarten, that, you know, teachers and students, it's a learned behavior that you learn over time, and you know very well who's in charge, and it's the teacher and it's not you. So that means if you assume a dominant role, this is going to be unacceptable. So if you remember last week, we talked, or the week before, we talked about the fact that only teachers close interactions, right? A student can't close an interaction. So that's the reason that you have IRFs in the classroom, initiations, feedback and responses, initiations, responses, and feedback. The feedback move at the end is for the teacher, not for the student, right? That said, as I've said here, teachers are usually unwilling to come across as authoritarian fascists. So they often try and mitigate this dominance in some kind of way. They use intonation choices that also create a sense of community. And remember, I said I didn't get any of these from my teachers, from my American English teachers. I got no dominant tones. I only got non-dominant falling tones. And if you remember, non-dominant falling tones, so this is like, I'm telling you something new, I'm completing my message, I'm demonstrating authority, I don't need to overdo it by using this tone as well, which would really sort of ups the ante, makes it clear that something's wrong. So if we remember looking back at the tone choices, for example, if you've got what a teacher will try and do is build this sense of community in the classroom, right? So build this middle ground. So in this case, you have a rising tone. So you could have the dominant rising tone, so right, or the non-dominant rising tone, so right. Okay. Either way, they're being used as interactional devices, right, to project a confirmation of common ground. But if you use the dominant rising tone, it's sort of doing both at the same time. The teacher's basically saying, I am the authority, but I am emphasizing that I am asking you if everything's okay. So if you look at different teaching contexts, you might find different uses. For example, tertiary level classrooms, so university level, higher education level classrooms, teachers may use a dominance tone, but then they might mitigate that tone. So this is an example of that idea from another prosodic corpus of classroom done by Cheng. This is a teacher telling a student to wrap it up, like they're talking and they need to stop. So could you sort of wrap it up in the next 5 minutes or so, please? Okay, so that's the dominant choice of the rising tone. It's a straight rise. It's perfectly appropriate because it's the dominant person in the interaction that's using it. And it's a way of saying, you know, enough already. Let's move it right along. Establishing that this teacher has the authority. It may often be present in classrooms with children, though. One of the reasons that I didn't find it in my work was that it's adults teaching other adults, right, for the most part. Well, adults teaching undergraduates who we are pretending are adults. So we're not likely to find it in there. But if you look at work that's been done with children in classes where there's a strong authoritarian presence of the teacher and children, you will find more of these tones. So the difference there between the non-dominant and the dominant might be something like this. I had Mark do this for us. It sounds, the second one, it's longer because the tone is longer, and it's also louder, which often goes with the dominant tone.
A, Peter, stop it. B, Peter, stop it.
Okay, can you hear that difference? Yeah.
A, Peter, stop it. B, Peter, stop it.
So he's louder, higher, but also the tones are longer. Peter, stop it, right? As opposed to Peter, stop it, right? So you may find it in with children, not likely to find it with adults. But what I found when I was doing this, well, so what we do once you start working out all these tone choices, you get what's called tonal composition, right? So a particular genre of discourse will have a particular kind of tonal composition. So if we go back to this idea of teaching discourse is a classic asymmetrical discourse. So we may find dominant tones, more likely to find them in falling tones with children than in adults, but certainly possibly with rising tones, because rising tones give you that, it's dominant, but it also gives you that sense of community. So what you find if you look across the research that's been done in this area, including mine with STEM classes and traditional English speaking instructors, so it's been British English and American English, there's always a majority of falling tones, which would make sense because you're in a classroom, so you're learning new information. This is tones used by the teachers. 60% falling tones, give or take, 30% rising tones, and about 10% level tones. So the level tones would be for continuing or for when you're going, rising tones are used to refer to some common ground or create a sense of community, like right or okay, those kinds of things. But when I looked at exactly equivalent, so if you look at exactly equivalent teaching presentations in a chemistry lab, for example, or in a math section, like I was looking at, and we looked at new or emerging English speakers. So my new English speakers were Indian, my emerging English speakers were Chinese. There was as low as 3 to 4% of rising tones. So that meant that you had a vast majority of falling tones, or falling tones and then a vast amount of level tones. So you can see this completely changes the sound. Okay, it's makes it to be a very different kind of sounding discourse. And that matters, it turns out, because it shifts the discourse from what we call a direct orientation, which is largely falling and rising tones and is directed towards the hearer. So, sorry, some of these parentheses are wrong. So a direct orientation toward the hearer, i.e. the students, and it changes it to an oblique orientation, which is largely falling and level tones, which is an orientation towards the language. So if you remember, we talked last week about the kids who are just like reading language samples out loud and like da 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 da, and it's that kind of idea. that the more you change the tonal composition toward an oblique orientation, the less it sounds like you're interested in your hearer, okay, that you're directing your discourse towards your hearer. So if you combine this with other behaviors that were often very prevalent with international teaching assistants, which included looking primarily at the board instead of turning around and looking at the students, there's this big lack of confirmation checks, particularly confirmation checks with rising tones, like, right, okay, you did this, you understand. And also a lot of failed one-to-one exchanges. So that would be, for example, if you're watching as I was watching these labs, after they gave these 20-minute questions, they would have to wander around the labs, for example, and look at what everybody's doing with their Bunsen burners and everything and answer questions as they came up, excuse me. So, but often undergraduates, when they ask questions, they don't say, you know, Lucy, I looked at this sample, or this sample is supposed to be orange, I think, but instead it's looking a bit pink to me. What they do is somebody comes over, the teacher comes over, and the undergraduate kind of looks at them, looks at the what's on top of the Bunsen burner and says, huh, pink? And the ITA has absolutely no idea what they mean, because it's too little telegraphed language information for them to understand, right? Or they don't hear, they don't understand that this person just said pink, so they don't put together that the person is basically saying, why is this pink? Sometimes undergraduates would just say things like, huh? You know, and point to something, and the non-native speaker would have no idea what was going on. So if you put all that together and you add on top of it these 20-minute presentations that sounded problematic from this point of view, then it was all contributing to the same perception. And the perception was that they were often disengaged, uninterested, uncooperative, lacking in empathy, and overall problematic. In your book, I've given you a quote from one undergraduate that was in Lippy Green. Of course, it's hard to understand them, and of course, I resent it. This is an undergraduate talking. Why can't I get what I pay for, which is a teacher like me who talks like me in my own language that I can understand? You might remember we talked about this idea of listener irritation, which is both a cognitive and an emotional reaction. And that's what happens when this is occurring. What's particularly important about this kind of discourse is, and I talk about it in my book, it's what's called binding discourse. It means that whatever happens in the classroom has a potential high stakes issue in the real world. So what the students are saying is, you're now messing with my GPA, basically. If I don't understand you, if you're not teaching me in a way I understand, then you're still going to grade me. I'm going to get a lower grade because I don't understand. It's not my fault, but I am bound by this in terms of something in the real world that then is going to cause me grief. So if you add all that together, this is all contributing to this sense. So what the intonation choices do, they don't control everything that goes on. It's not, I'm not saying that if all your intonation is wonderful and your morphosyntax is terrible and you never smile, then you'll be fine. But it's part of the contributing factor, and we tend to only think of morphosyntax, right? We don't tend to think of intonation in this kind of way, but in fact it also is contributing to that. So that the importance of that particularly is binding discourse with now binding discourse also occurs outside of the classroom. It occurs between a doctor and a patient, for example, in between a parent and a child. You know, these are all often cases of binding discourse that somebody has something to lose if it goes wrong. So that makes it a much more high pressured interaction, particularly if it's asymmetrical. So, any questions or comments or clarifications about that?
I wanted to throw a comment out.
Thank you, Sarah.
I was thinking, especially since I brought up and we've talked about, you know, how teachers speak to their kids. I've really been, especially since I work with like middle school age kids and not other adults, which I know a lot of other people in the class work with adults. I've been listening to how I talk and how they respond. And something when I read the chapter earlier that stuck out with me, and then when you brought it up again today or tonight, when we look at the examples of like Peter, stop it.
Mm-hmm.
And then that I have caught myself so many times doing that. So I teach for a virtual school. So we use Zoom for all of our lessons, and my kids are all 12, 13, and 14. So they see a chat box and immediately they're like, what's your favorite color? What TV show do you watch? Did you guys get the new PS5? And I constantly have to remind them, all right, guys, we're in language arts. We need to bring the chat back into focus. And I've noticed that when I do it, the first time it's, all right, guys, bring the chat back in focus. And then later it's chat.
Yeah, right.
It becomes much more of that direct and that not just, all right, guys, let's bring the chat back. It like chat.
Right. Yeah.
Or it's gonna go off.
Yes.
And
yes.
I've noticed that switch when it's the first time versus the third time.
Yep.
Like pay attention to what you're doing versus do it again and it's getting turned off.
Yes, right. Well, then that's exactly it. Well, first of all, let me say, Sarah, I have much admiration for you teaching 12, 13 and 14-year-olds and teaching them virtually where they've got access to a chat box. I think I would probably shoot myself. So good for you.
Mine is poor. So.
Yeah. But well, you're a lot younger and zippier than me, so but still, I'm very impressed. Yeah, that's exactly correct. So it's a contribution to what's happening. It's not that you're only changing your intonation. You're changing a set of language cues, one of which is your intonation. And that's important because native, traditional English speakers, native English speakers of American and British English, Canadian English will recognize that as you're being told off. So if a non-native speaker or a speaker of new Englishes that we're about to move on to with the next chapter uses something like that, not understanding that this is what's happening, then it still is given meaning by the traditional English speaker. Hence the example we started off with in the book with the gravy example. It's assumed that you understand what it is that you're implying or inferencing when you use these intonation patterns, and that's why it's so important. In your case, they do know. And hopefully it has, does it have some effect, Sarah? Do they start being better behaved?
Most of the time, and usually within the first month or so of classes, the kids start to learn the routines of which teachers let students get away with what. And after a couple of weeks of class, and we have class every day, so you know, they get to see each teacher every day and really get to know what we do. And after maybe 3 or 4 weeks, you'll start to see certain kids, if they get off track, other kids will type in the chat, guys, keep it on track. She's going to turn the chat off. And they start to kind of
Right.
police each other before I even hit that point.
Right. Right.
They're 13, so there's always kids that are like, no, I just want to talk about games. And
Oh, God.
but for the most part, it works out, and then they start to just watch each other.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, that's great. That's a perfect example. The absolutely perfect example of how it integrates with everything else that's going on in the context. Thank you, Sarah. Does anyone else have anything they want to add? Okay. And in that case, we're going to switch, bearing all of that in mind. So as we move through these things, we want to bear all of these things in mind. So far, we've got meaningful contributions of pitch movement, pitch level, volume level, etc. And you want to keep all that in mind, because it's that overall cueing that contributes. It's not usually any one individual thing. So this chapter, this is the first of 2 chapters that look at additional Englishes. So new Englishes, and then chapter 8 that you'll read over Thanksgiving is emerging Englishes. So emerging Englishes is learner, what we would normally call learner English. So from, you know, English that's being taught in, that's being spoken in China, Japan, whatever. New English is the second diaspora, so that's, you know, when it went out in colonies, essentially. So you're talking Indian Englishes, African English, Singaporean English, Philippine English, Malaysian English, these kinds of Englishes that are used as one of the major languages of communication in that area, but usually not the only language of communication, right? There's an example in my book of an Indian English speaker who, you know, watches sports in one language, you know, goes to the government and deals with the government office in another language, goes home and talks to his grandmother in another language. So, you know, these are the kinds of places that we're talking about. However, places where English has a very firm and long history as one part of the language pattern in that country. So there's often a common perception that we are using a mutual code of communication that varies marginally. So, for example, if you, in Filipino English, they will say furnitures instead of furniture. And you might hear that and say, oh, that's interesting that they use, you know, they have a plural furnitures. In Indian English, they'll say things like, I'm having a headache, instead of I have a headache. So you might notice that and say, but clearly it's the vocabulary is a little bit different, but you can understand what they're saying. But when it comes to intonation, of course, again, this idea that it's very unconscious, there are also lots of differences, but they don't which can affect communication, but they don't necessarily get recognized and understood. This shouldn't be surprising, by the way, because I think we've talked about this before. You've obviously got a lot of integration, or some integration, between local languages and between the English that's used, particularly if it's been there for a long time. So, and if you think of something like Indian English, we know that one of the ways we recognize that in phonology is heavily retroflexed t and d, right? So it's ta, ta, da, da, which is a retroflexed t and da, dar, dar, dar. It's your tongue goes all the way back and then hits way back in the back of yours. So we know that there are systematic phonological differences, and that also applies to intonation as well. However, we don't think about the effect that that might have on intercultural communication. So why does it matter? We're going back again to this idea of behaviors are never ignored, right? We assume that they're designed to be understood as a contribution. We assume that these behaviors mean something. So, for example, if there's lots of falling tones, or if there's an extra loud volume and we perceive possible anger, or we are honed by long expectation of communication within our speech community to assume that interlocutors are going to mirror our own behavior. Even if we know we're in an intercultural communication situation, this is something that's called, this is not in my book, but it's something, if I did a second edition, I would talk about. It's most recently been talked about in neuropragmatics as hot communication. It's called hot cognition versus cold cognition. So it's the idea that we have some very fast neurophysiological processes at work. We process something in our communication very quickly versus not processing it so quickly. So morphosyntactic issues, things like I'm having a headache, furnitures, you process, but you'll process more slowly, and what's called cold cognition. Whereas hot communication means that it's just your reaction to it is immediate, and it's going to be based on what you have experienced in your speech community. It's very difficult to have an instant reaction and then go back and say, wait, my instant reaction is probably because, you know, he's talking a bit louder than I'm used to, and he's probably not angry with me, really. That's just not how hot communication works. So this makes minority English speakers in institutional contexts, in traditional English environments, particularly vulnerable, because if they have these different hot communication issues in hot communication, so they will say something differently and it will be perceived very quickly by traditional English speakers as meaningful in some way that's negative, then they're going to have a problem. And this has been called the linguistic penalty, and it's basically the same idea as what you might think of as an ethnic penalty or a class penalty. You know, someone comes and they're obviously a minority, an ethnic minority, or a class social minority. Linguistic penalty has the same, this exactly the same idea, that you may have systematic linguistic behaviors that are going to penalize you in particularly linguistic penalties, particularly applied to things where there's high stakes interaction. So interaction in the workplace, interaction with government officials, anything that could start costing you. So think about these in terms really of asymmetrical interactions rather than chit-chatting with your buddy, right? So you might have, for example, an Indian English speaking buddy who you've noticed that there are some differences, but you really don't care because it's your friend, versus somebody who's trying to get a promotion in an office and is having these kinds of issues. So what are some of these systematic differences in intonation between New Englishes and traditional Englishes? We're going to start with Indian English. Indian English is a little bit of a problem. I know some of you are teaching, have taught, and are teaching Indian English students. And course, one of the issues with Indian English is, despite the fact that it's across India and it's used across India, there is what we call a decline of bilingualism, meaning usually depending on region and social class, your English may be more or less similar, to standard American English. So in other words, if you're a wealthy Hindi speaking Northern Indian person, the chances are that your education in India has moved you more toward, you have been exposed more toward a general Indian English standard that sounds more like American English. If you are a poor person from southern India who has spent most of their time speaking their local language and has only been exposed to English through school, and your English teacher at school is another southern rural speaker, you may be much more difficult to understand, in the sense that your English may be further away from a standard model, and thus even further away from American English. So recognizing that we recognize that, and not all Indian English speakers sound the same, etc., etc., there are some pan-Indian features. By that we mean general Indian English features that can confuse everybody, and that are a part of the variety itself. Here's one of them. It's a phonetic realization of prominence. So when we talk about prominence, we talk about recognizing the important word or words in the thought group. So often with Indian English speakers, more often than not, they have a sort of opposite melody than what. So instead of saying mother, high, low, they'll say mother, low, high. So you start to lose the stress pattern, right? Because you're listening, your ear, if you're a traditional English speaker, is listening for da-da. So da-da, you think it might be the second one, not the first one, right? Because you're listening for that higher pitch. So here are some examples that come from actual speech, Indian English speech, that I've recorded or someone else has recorded, where you can see the difference between how these words are being perceived. So the first example is the word defense, right? So when an IE speaker, an Indian English speaker, says defense, they'll say defense, defense, okay? And what a traditional English speaker will often hear is difference, 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 instead of defense, right? We can look at it in the second one, rendered. So it's rendered. And what you get, which would be rendered for us, and it's perceived by Americans as endured instead. The last one is impedance, impedance, which doesn't sound like impedance and usually gets translated as impudence. So I hope you can hear some of those. Obviously, I'm not an Indian English speaker, so I'm just trying to do that the way that sounds. And that's a pan-American, a pan-Indian feature that a lot of Indian English speakers have, regardless of their first language background. There's another pan-Indian feature with regard to contrastive stress patterns. So in American English or British English, traditional English is, if we have a contrastive stress pattern, if we want to contrast a previous piece of information, we'll put a stress on it, right? So if you think of these examples, this is a traditional English speaker talking to another traditional English speaker. I will be both traditional speakers. Okay, what's your phone number? 583-5937. 584-5937. No, 583-5937. Okay, that's a classic contrastive stress pattern, meaning I'm highlighting the digit that you got wrong. Okay, so that's to help you, right? No, I'm repeating the number, but I'm highlighting the digit that you got wrong. Okay, so we can hear what that sounds like. It's a little overdone, but you'll get the general idea. No?
Okay, what's your phone number?
583-5937.
584-5937.
Oh no, 583-5937.
Okay, so you get the general idea. That's pretty much how it would go. What we find when we look at Indian English is they don't have that contrastive stress pattern in similar situations. So they, instead of contrasting one digit, will repeat the entire number with no contrast on that single digit. So I'll have you listen to this, because this is what I recorded with an Indian English speaker.
Okay, what's your phone number?
583-5937.
584-5937.
No, 583-5937.
Exactly the same pattern. Did you hear that? There was absolutely no difference in the first one. She says 583-5937. Second one, she says 583-5937. Have a listen to it again.
Okay, what's your phone number?
583-5937.
584-5937.
No, 583-5937.
Isn't that interesting? I always found that kind of fascinating. What was fascinating to me was John Gumprez, the guy we've talked about before, said that this happens. You know, he wrote it in his book in the 1980s. And I was like, really? And at the time I was working in Georgia State, and above me, directly above me on the floor, were all the computer science people. And there were like 1 million Indian English speakers. So I was like, great. What I'm going to do is go up there, find a couple, bring them back down, and we're going to test out this theory. And I tested 3 separate ones, and they all did exactly the same thing. He was exactly right. There was no contrastive stress pattern in this example at all. So very, very interesting. And again, I'm sure, as you can imagine, if you're trying to communicate information and it's anything like a high stakes interaction, you're expecting your behavior to be mirrored. So if one digit is wrong and you're an American English speaker, you're expecting that to be stressed because that's the one that's wrong. Everything else was right? It just seems logical. So then it starts to get annoying if people are not doing that. So there are additional issues in Indian English, which I didn't. One of them is in the book, and it's the choice of pitch. And I've shown you a couple of examples there. That's that page, which you can't see, but it's page 88. And it's the difference between these huge pitch leaps. So what you're looking at in those figures, figure 7.1, in the first one, you're looking at the small intonation choices made by an American. He says is X1, M1, X1. So he's talking about a formula. So he says this is X1, M1, X1. Now, if you look at what's happening with the Indian English speaker, he says this one is X, 2 minus XC. All right. So there's these dramatic shifts in pitch. That's the fundamental frequency that you're looking at. So you completely lose this key pattern where you go up one, down one, and then you finish down at the bottom. So that's that one. Unit boundaries that contain subcontours. So the sentence is divided into small prosodic units rather than longer units. And if you remember, we did this. You can listen to that file again if you want, but there was the Indian English speaker, Madhari, who was on the phone call. I was waiting to use that one. So you had some examples from there. That's very common with Indian English speaking. So there are a number of conventions that are going to cause potential problems there. Then there's something on other New Englishes. There's been quite a lot of work by one researcher on Singaporean English and Malaysian English and the differences between Singaporean Malaysian English and traditional Englishes. I think I've talked about this before really briefly, but the biggest one is what's called heavy end stress. And heavy end stress means that it doesn't matter whether what's at the end of the unit is important or not important, it gets stressed, right? Because the stress moves to the end of the unit. So what is it? Don't ask, just eat it. Okay. What is it? Don't ask, just eat it. Which for us would be, what is it? Don't ask, just eat it, right? Because you wouldn't have the shift, the stress to the final end because it's a pronoun, right? So it would be understood. So we wouldn't shift it here. So we would say, what is it? Don't ask. We might say, don't ask, just eat it, right? Because it's not new, this is old information. So heavy end stress creates a rhythmic problem, but it can also create a information processing problem, because the prominence that we're looking for, remember we're talking about looking for important information through prominence, we're not getting it. What we're getting is repeated old information, and so we have to reprocess that sentence again. Another one she had from Singaporean English was, I thought you wanted a black one. No, a blue one. Again, it's this heavy end stress. I thought you wanted a black one. No, a blue one, right, is what we would do. So again, you've got that informational kind of issue. Same idea of subcontouring. She found that in a lot of, this was Malaysian, I think, that they had these small subcontours like the Indian English. So because I won't be able to see the other traffic light, for example, she doesn't have any sound files, sadly, so you can't listen to her work, but listen to her data, but that would be the exact same kind of idea that we saw with the Indian English speaker. Also, she found a lot of level and falling tone choices in places where we wouldn't expect them. So, where did you go yesterday? That's perfectly normal. I went to the cinema yesterday. So again, you've got this repeated information that yesterday at the end sounds totally weird with a falling tone, because that should be, if it was us, it would be new information, right? But it isn't new information, it's old information. We would say I went to the cinema yesterday, or we would just say I went to the cinema. We wouldn't bother repeating it at all because it's old. We certainly wouldn't stress it and put it with a falling tone as though it was new information. So again, the problem here is, and I can't reiterate this enough. The problem here is not these little individual choices that happen one at a time. It's when you have a long piece of discourse, again, particularly in a high stakes interaction or binding kind of discourse situation where somebody really needs to listen. Someone's really trying to understand everything that you're saying because for some reason it's important. These kinds of miscues begin to add up. And in this chapter, I talk about the thing we've talked about before in terms of listener irritation, Eisenstein's idea of how this sort of builds up into a way that then makes it more and more difficult to focus. So some of the important differences that we've looked at here, differences in phonetic realization of prominence. So it's difficult to recognize the word stress. That was the different melody patterns. So the low high instead of the high low. Pitch leaps that don't correspond to what we talked about before in terms of key choices. So they don't go high to mid, mid to low, low to low. You know, they sort of are jumping up and down across the pitch spectrum. Prominence placement that doesn't necessarily indicate important information, so we get confused. That would be like the one we just did. I went to the cinema yesterday. It's like I already knew that it was yesterday, and so you know, you start getting confused. Shorter units, subcontours, shorter units and subcontours that obfuscate tonic syllables. So this is, you know, if you've got lots of small units, you don't get that nice long suspension bridge pattern that we've looked at before. That is the expectation of traditional English speakers in the majority of tone units that they hear. Overuse of falling tones and also level tones in some cases, which again gives this impression of either great distancing between yourselves, or lots of information that's more important that in fact isn't important. So that's a kind of summary. What are the pedagogical implications for this, for those of you that are working or will be working? So this is a very different situation than speakers of emerging English is. So your Chinese learners or your Japanese learners or Arabic learners, because these speakers are not English language learners in the traditional sense of the word, okay? They already have a variety of English that they're perfectly comfortable with. The other problem is there's no one size fits all because of this often decline of bilingualism. So you might have some in your class that sound great, that sound virtually normal, meaning virtually like American standard English you would expect, and some that these pan-Indian features are so strong that it's a real problem. So that is also can be a problem if you have a class of or a whole group of Indian speakers. Another problem is that you can sometimes get pushback. I don't know, I would be very interested to hear from any of you who are either here today or who are at home listening, if they've had any pushback from Indian English speakers or Malay or Singapore, but most often in America we're teaching Indian English speakers. Because they recognize their own variety, as they should, as a legitimate variety. So they are not often not clear and not happy about being instructed, and particularly put in classrooms with people that they consider to be language learners from Chinese or English language learners from China or from Arabia or from different places, when they consider their own variety to be perfectly legitimate. So they don't necessarily understand the struggles that speaker hearers outside their community. So they know they're different, but that doesn't necessarily mean to them that it's a deficit. Whereas for Americans, it does mean it's a deficit. So I had one of my students talk. I mean, various of my students have worked with Indian English as I have, but this was one of my graduate students in Georgia who was trying to get to this. And she said, okay, so let's talk about accent. You know, you would have what we term an Indian English accent. And the Indian English speaker said, yeah. And is this something you were taught in school? She says. And he says, well, we weren't taught a separate accent. We're not taught to have an accent at all. It was actually what we saw from the teachers and we got. So, you know, so she says, right. She says, I would say Indian English has a characteristic of its own. There's British English, there's American English, there's Indian English, you know, so what? So they understand that it's different, but they don't automatically see it as a deficit problem. Different is one thing, deficit is another one. Whereas Americans will almost always see things as a deficit issue. So if they're struggling with Indian English or a new English particularly, they immediately conceive of this as a deficit issue. Like, you should be speaking American English. This in and of itself can cause a lot of resentment on the part of both parties, but particularly, as you might expect, on the part of Indian English speakers who feel like it shouldn't be their problem, or it certainly shouldn't be their problem alone. So for this group, in general, I haven't talked about any specific exercises, but in general, language analysis is almost always more effective than language instruction. So in other words, discuss it, talk about the differences, be clearly motivated, be transparent, have them listen to these kinds of examples. You can use the dialect archive, for example, that we've used before, the idea archive. You can explain differences and why they're difficult to, you know, those particular differences make things difficult to understand. My best successes have been in this kind of approach, which means, of course, that if you have a student group, which I have had, and which I'm sure some of you either have or have had or may have, which includes emerging English speakers and new English speakers, it's complicated because you have to try and find a way to address those different needs. But treating them all like it's all exactly the same is usually a mistake. You'll probably end up with quite resentful adult learners who don't believe themselves to have the same kinds of problems. And it's true, they really don't. It's a different issue that they're struggling with. So emphasize, despite the more familiar patterns that might occur with new Englishes as opposed to LX, by that I mean learner Englishes, you know. So they say, look, the vocabulary is the same, you know, the syntax is basically the same, you know. So despite the fact that this is true in many cases, there is still plenty of room for misinterpretation between a new English dialect of English and a traditional English one. And again, you can go through and show some of these examples and have them listen and have them think about it. Obviously, these are adults, as I say, not children. New Englishes are not the same as traditional Englishes, meaning, of course, there are differences between the way I'm talking to you now as a British English speaker and the way you would talk to me if you are an American English speaker. There's no, I don't sound like you, you don't sound like me. But the difference is when it comes to intonation, we have the same kinds of patterns. The area of tolerance, what we call an area of tolerance between one traditional English and another, is similar enough that we understand, we have the same instincts and the same sort of hot communication button things that generally speaking are not a problem. You can go between Canadian English, American English, British English, and you won't get the kinds of misinterpretations that we've been talking about here between traditional Englishes and new Englishes. So that's the difference, that some differences fall into an area of tolerance that is unproblematic. It's different, but it's not creating this idea of different behaviors. So it's a good time to remind them and yourself that discourse is cooperative, that it's guided by a principle of co-construction. So negotiation is critical. And this is one thing that you can talk to your students about and try and give them examples of, that it doesn't all rest with them. And it doesn't all rest with it doesn't all rest with the speaker, and it doesn't all rest with the hearer. They have to try and find that middle ground, that speaker and hearer middle ground. So if you're trying to teach them, for example, a difference between prominence patterns or so on, you're not doing it because you want them to be American or that they need to be American. You're doing it to try and find this middle space between that's going to make communication easier. So this is not about who has the better variety. And I can't emphasize that enough, because for us often we just conceive of traditional English as being the better variety. And particularly if we're quite monolingual in our own approach and we haven't had much experience. But for speakers of other varieties, it's perfectly, their variety is perfectly normal. They have perfectly successful lives, using this variety of English. And so it's not like they suddenly come here and say, oh, of course my English variety suddenly isn't going to work. So, and you shouldn't and can't expect them to have that realization. Finally, the other thing I always say is that ESL instructors are not immune from the kinds of stereotyping linguistic responses that we have looked at in this chapter. So, we are not exempt from hot communication, hot cognition, having an instant response to something somebody says. So we need to remind ourselves of that, because I think often we think that we're very, very aware of everything that's happening inside the classroom and our responses to it, and the fact that we're addressing learners and so on. And these kinds of issues, that isn't necessarily the case. We can have exactly the same kind of misunderstandings as anybody else might have, and that it's important that we recognize that, so that that will help us as professionals help them, right? I think about this in terms of, support calls, for example. One of the things at the back of one of the activities at the back of this chapter is some of the comments that are typically made about call center language, for example. I hate Indian call centers. They have an accent you can't understand. I have trouble understanding, and so on. And people get very annoyed. And, I have spent the last, since 1995, working with Indian English in various and so you think that I'd have a clue. But I find myself I can, if I'm having a bad day and things are not going well and I can't understand this bloody person talking on the phone, that, you know, I start having these negative cognitive and emotional reactions, even though I know that it's just a difference and we both need to back up and just sort of slow down and start listening a little bit differently to each other. I'm just as vulnerable as anybody else if I'm having a bad day. So we as professionals want to recognize that that is, you know, that can happen to us as well, and sort of, you know, take a deep breath and think about what it is that we're trying to communicate to our students. So yeah, that takes us to the end of that chapter. Anybody got any comments or questions or clarifications I can give? Anybody having this experience or had this experience with their students in class?
Well, Dr. Pickering, I'm not a teacher, but I guess I've had a few verbal altercations or been privy to some where a lot of, because I work in the government, so a lot of the people that are bosses typically are dogmatic, prior military, you know, colonels, majors, and they have a very prescriptive approach to what language should be. So there are some people that speak Indian English or English from the Philippines, and generally we all get along and we all understand them. But it's always those bosses that are like, you're not speaking correctly.
Right.
And it's just so, it's irritating. And I even had to get into a verbal altercation with one of them over a Zoom call. And I'm like, look, I'm about to help these people file an EEO report against you if you don't quit it.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh,
it's gotten
Aaliyah,
so bad.
This is such a perfect example of the linguistic penalty that you're just going to have to write it up for me for extra credit, because that's the perfect example of linguistic penalty where a supervisor is basically critiquing someone and essentially stopping their work productivity over their accent use. Do you see what I mean?
No, absolutely. And it's just, I don't want to pull the race card or, you know, the gender card or anything like that. But when there are people in the office or over Zoom that have a very thick Southern accent or an English accent, and you don't say anything, you ask for clarification if you need it. But then if someone who speaks African American vernacular English or Indian English or Singaporean English, you have a problem with it, it's like, you have to consider some people don't have another code to switch to.
This is absolutely correct. Yes, yes. Wow, that's so astonishing. It always amazes me. I was thinking this last week when we were talking about some of people's experiences. It always amazes me how little you have to scratch the surface on some of these things, and everybody's experiences pop out, and they're happening all the time, you know, and we don't really talk about it. But yeah, you don't have to scratch the surface very far to find that these linguistic experiences are happening every day and can be really problematic. See, in a case like that, what was the report that you could file? Is that like basically what's that report thing that you said?
So it's called an EEO report, which is an equal employment opportunity. And
Right.
essentially what happens is if someone feels like they're denied a promotion or a move or anything of that nature on the grounds of race, orientation, anything like that, that is considered discriminatory, they can go to an EO officer, sit down with a mediator and the person who committed the infraction and talk it out. And some of these people, the people that I'm describing that are committing these infractions are like, well, I'm not racist, I'm not this. And I've actually had to sit down with them like, actually you are, and this is why. You have a bias that needs to be addressed. And like, well, they should speak right. It's like, okay, well, I'll help these people win over 100K if that means
Good for you, Leah.
that you'll stop. Like, I've considered leaving the government several times because I'm just noticing more and more that it's very much like a good old boys environment. It's very dog whistly. So when people say, oh, you work for the government, it's so cool. And I'm like, well, I'm having an easier time because I speak the standard American English accent. You know, I have a degree. There are people that are military and they deserve these jobs. They serve their country, so they go into civil service and they're treated like crap for
Right.
stuff that they can't really control.
Yeah, and so you can't leave. You have to keep filing these things for them and pointing out the infractions. You can't leave now, Leah. It's too late.
I mean, I've already like picked fights with like 5 colonels already. I'm like, I'm never getting promoted in here.
I know.
Oh my
Well,
goodness.
I can't. I mean, on the one hand, I'm horrified. On the other hand, this is exactly where all this research is stemming from, and it just goes to show you that in 21st century, you know, a lot of this work started in the 70s, and the really big push was in the 80s. And Gumperz himself, the guy that started it in the 60s and the 70s, he was German and Jewish and was watched as his, you know, parents' lives fell apart and they moved to Britain. So he had a very strong sense of who had the power and who didn't have the power. And I was really drawn to this kind of analysis. And it when linguistic analysis, and when you tell me stories like that, I can see why. And there's an extent to which we have to hold our institutions accountable to this, which is why I say you can't leave now, Alea. Because, you know, that's something that should be coming from the top, you know. So if the top is doing this, then we should be holding these people accountable for that in any way that we can hold them accountable. So yeah, but you're right, it's probably going to cost you your promotion.
It's okay. I mean, I can work a couple of side jobs to make up for it, so it's fine. But I've noticed a lot where, like, because I work for the Department of the Air Force, but there's, you know, Homeland Security and Department of Education. But a lot of these large institutions and parts of government, they hire people that are just like them. So they say, oh, I want people with fresh ideas and, you know, a new outlook. And they don't really mean that. They just want people that are going to come in and reaffirm what they already think. And it's tiring, but
Oh, bless your heart. Well, between you and Sarah, you're exhausting me today. You're exhausted with people's behavior in your office. Sarah's having to deal with 12, 13, and 14-year-olds being obnoxious on chat. I'm just like, oh my God, you guys are, go for it. Because I'm exhausted just listening to these experiences.
oh, me too. But I mean, I don't like to think of myself as a very confrontational person, but when it just sucks because when I was in school, I had a very thick African American vernacular English accent because that's all I knew. And my teachers, I guess, beat it out of me.
Yeah.
So I can code switch now. So when I see people that are learning English or they they're very resistant to switching codes because that's a part of your identity, and they're being grilled for it. It just really burns my biscuits, you know.
Well, good for you, Aaliyah. You're definitely in the right degree. Yeah, I have nothing to say except for that's exactly what all this was about. Yeah, and code switching from new Englishes to traditional Englishes is, you know, you really want to think about it, because it might be socially and politically expedient, but you want to think in your own terms about how you feel about like this, you know, like Aaliyah's saying, you know, do you feel this is appropriate, or do you think, you know, if you see something like that, you should go to someone and say, look, you know, it's not a bad English, it's you know, it's a different English. So yeah, some institutions, banks, for example, have worked with linguists and to try and stop some of this kind of behavior. There was a study in a Bank of America in San Francisco, where there was a lot of problems with Chinese accented English, and somehow these people going into the pipeline and then never getting promoted. They just sort of hit a wall, even though their work was fine. You know, they have no particular problems, but then somehow some barrier is communication barrier is happening. So so there are some institutions that are working with this, and then others that you know, need a good kick in the pants. Anybody else?
As a short add-on, I'll throw out a good experience I've had when I was in elementary school. So they weren't 12 and 13 yet. They were like 8 and 9. I had one student that, because we are a cyber school, we're considered charter. So we're public, but families that come to us have to choose to do it. Like, they have to apply and come in, and every student is accepted because it's public, but they have to go through that process. So when we get new families, we always ask, like, what brought you here? Kind of as a, what can we make sure we do that your last school wasn't doing? And one student in particular stands out to me. She was born and raised raised till like age 6, and then she moved to the States, but in India. And the reason they moved to the States is because her mom was getting a medical doctorate through, I think, Johns Hopkins, something that they were up in Pennsylvania area, Philly area. And they said they had gone through the city school district and 2 other like brick and mortar charters. And every single time they immediately flagged the student and said, oh no, she needs ESL classes. But she didn't.
She didn't.
She actually, as of last week, is now in the National Junior Honor Society. She absolutely did not need ESL courses.
Right.
She understood the language. They came to us, and on the initial phone call when they enrolled, they said, do you speak any other languages in the house? And they went through that conversation, and they said, has she had ESL services before? And they said yes, but they've never been helpful because she already speaks English. And they said, okay, we'll just put you in an English class. And probably 3 weeks in, I had a conversation with that parent on the phone, and she said, I cannot tell you how glad we are that somebody is actually listening to us and letting her be in a normal class. And that has led her to now, 3 or 4 years later, she's in the honor society. And because they weren't trying to push her and say, oh no, you speak a different form of English, therefore you need to be in ESL. They said, oh no, you speak English, you're good, you here, have the regular classes. And
well, thanks for that, Sarah. Spin on that's it. A great story to finish with. I like positive stories. That's perfect. Yeah. So, and that's also another example. In that case, that's very interesting because I guess the parent was pushing for the child too, as well as the child being frustrated. But that's a very good example of some of the pushback that you can get with this group of learners, particularly if they're shoved in with what they consider to be, second language learners when they're not. So, and there's no recognition of that, so that's great. God, it's so nice to hear a nice story about a state school. That's awesome. Public school. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys. I like I say, you scratch the surface and here it all comes. Homework. You've got a reading post, answer the questions in 6.5, 7.4. Activity 8, respond to 2 activities in 6.6 and 2 activities in 7.5. So I hope you'll have some fun with those. This is supposed to be kind of thought provoking and interesting. So I hope that certainly hearing these experiences has been is great for me. All right, so I am going to love you and leave you, and I will not see you next week because it's Thanksgiving. So happy Thanksgiving again. There'll be no Zoom lecture and no lecture online either, so no written lecture. So just go ahead, read chapter 8, put together any thoughts you have about anything that you might not understand. We'll look at that when we look at the other 2 chapters on the last week. If you have any questions as you get started on your lesson plans, I'm right here, so just let me know. Otherwise, we are done. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.